Welcome to the lectures for Basics of Hebrew Discourse, a guide to working with Hebrew prose and poetry by Patton and Fred Putnam. My name is Miles Van Pelt, and I'm the editor of this project, a project designed to be used in conjunction with your Hebrew studies after your first year of biblical language study. So with a resource like Basics of Hebrew Discourse, we need to ask ourselves the question, what is discourse or discourse analysis? Look at your screen with me. Discourse analysis works to identify and understand the ways in which texts are arranged and connected in order to express meaning and logical progression. So discourse analysis is really the study of how texts are created by placing clauses side by side together and are connected one to another. Let me explain to you discourse analysis in this way. You know that consonants and vowels work together to create syllables, or a single unit of pronunciation. This is called phonology. For example, we can have open syllables or closed syllables, and those syllables can be in the propretonic, pretonic, or tonic position. And you also know that syllables generally begin with a consonant and have only one vowel in Hebrew. These are the rules of Hebrew syllables, and that's phonology, how sounds go together to create meaningful bits of sound that will eventually create words. But you also know that syllables work together to create words. So in the previous slide, we had two words that were syllabified, and now you see them here together. The first one is the masculine singular noun, davar, meaning word. And the second one is the masculine plural noun, davarim, meaning words. Here you see the syllables being placed together to create whole word units. This is called morphology, or the formation of words. And they, again, follow certain rules. You also know that words work together to create phrases. And this is something we call syntax. So syllables work together to create words, and words work together to create phrases. And the way in which those phrases relate, we call that syntax. So we have here in our first example, the word of Yahweh. We have two words in a construct relationship that make up a meaningful unit. In our second example, according to these words, we have a prepositional phrase that is constructed in a way that makes sense in terms of Hebrew grammar and syntax. And there are rules that govern the way in which words relate one to another. That's called syntax or microsyntax. And you also know that phrases work together with verbs to create clauses. So we're going to take syllables and make words, words and make phrases, and then phrases with verbs to make clauses. We're building our hierarchy here. So we have in this example on the screen, we have the main verb that appears in black. We have the subject of that verb, a construct chain, the word of Yahweh. So the word of Yahweh was. And then we have three prepositional phrases that modify that particular clause. When did the word of Yahweh come? It came after these things or after these words. And to whom did it come? It came to Abram. And how did it come? Well, it came in the vision. So here we have prepositional phrases, a construct chain, and a verb all working together to create a single clause. So we have phonology, how consonants and vowels relate together to make sounds. And then we have morphology, how those sounds create words. And then we have microsyntax, or syntax of words within a single clause or within a single phrase. And that's called syntax or microsyntax. It's what you would normally think of as syntax. In these lectures, and in conjunction with Basics of Hebrew Discourse by Patton and Fred Putnam, we will learn how clauses work together to create texts, paragraphs, and even books. And we're going to call this discourse analysis or macrosyntax. If you think about everything that occurs within a single clause is microsyntax, and then the ways in which those clauses relate to form larger units of thoughts, that's going to be called macrosyntax. So we have microsyntax, what we normally think of as syntax, and then macrosyntax or discourse analysis. Once again, discourse analysis works to identify and understand the ways in which texts are arranged and then connected in order to express meaning and logical progression. And we can also call this macrosyntax. We want to understand not only what a text says or means, but we also want to understand how the text says what it means. The how of textual meaning is the study of discourse analysis. That is, Hebrew is going to connect clauses together in meaningful ways, and we need to study and understand those ways in order to properly interpret the text. English will also connect clauses in meaningful ways according to English conventions. The conventions that we have in English are not necessarily the same conventions we have in Hebrew, so we need to learn how to translate those conventions from Hebrew into English. When you're translating any biblical text, you're not just translating the words, you're translating phonology and morphology and grammar, microsyntax and macrosyntax. All of these steps across the spectrum need to be carefully handled in order to achieve an accurate translation and an accurate understanding of the text. So we understand that discourse features in English are different than discourse features in biblical or classical Hebrew. A skilled translator and interpreter must learn how to render the discourse features of Hebrew into English. Let's look at this example together. First, let's translate it together. Come here, so that I may send you to the king. You'll see we have two verbs connected by the conjunction wow. The two verbs appear in red, bo and eshlacha. The first verb is imperative. The second verb is cal imperfect 1cs. Now observe that the verbs are connected by the conjunction wow highlighted in blue. But I didn't translate the conjunction like we normally would with the simple and. I translated it with the expression in English so that, expressing purpose. Why? Let's look at the last paragraph together on your screen. In Hebrew, an imperative verb may be followed by an imperfect verb with the conjunction wow. This construction may create a purpose or result clause, and we would translate it so that. That is, in Hebrew, you can have an imperative verb followed by an imperfect verb joined by the conjunction wow. And that conjunction wow and that chain of relationships creates a special discourse feature in Hebrew that allows you to translate the conjunction as so that or expressing purpose. In English, we don't have that same reality with the verb and. We use the expression so that or in order to express purpose. But in Hebrew, they can do it with the conjunction wow. In order to properly translate and interpret this verse, you have to understand these discourse relationships and how to properly identify them in context. So how are clauses connected in Hebrew? Well, you'll understand that different languages connect clauses in different ways. Some languages, like English or Greek, use lots of different clause connectors to connect their clauses. Other languages, however, like Hebrew, use relatively few connectors. In biblical Hebrew, there are only 4 main clause connectors. Now, there are a host of other minor connectors, and we'll talk about those in Basics of Hebrew Discourse. But we want to just cover the 4 main discourse connectors here, and then show you one quick example of how those features can appear in a particular text. The main clause connector for biblical Hebrew is the conjunction wow. It occurs over 50,000 times and can connect words, phrases, and clauses, and denote a whole host of discourse relationships. The second main clause connector is the relative pronoun asher. This occurs over 5,500 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it normally begins relative clauses that will modify other nouns or nominal items. We come to the particle key, which is normally prefixed to clauses that modify verbs, and subordinate clauses that will give reason or purpose to the main verb. Our last clause connector is actually a zero clause connector, or the absence of a clause connector. When you have no clause connector in a language, we call this a syndeton or parataxis. This is the zero clause connector, and it occurs with great frequency in the Hebrew Bible. Let's take a look at how the conjunction wow and the zero clause connector work in context. Our examples come from Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. These are portions of the giving of the Decalogue, first in Exodus 20 and then in Deuteronomy 5. Let's look at the Exodus 20 category first, the left column. You'll observe, according to the way in which the text is laid out in verses 13 through 17, that there are 6 contiguous prohibitions, each beginning with the negative particle lo. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not answer against your neighbor with a false testimony, do not covet the house of your neighbor, and do not covet the wife of your neighbor. Now you'll observe that these 6 contiguous prohibitions each begin with a negative particle lo, and there's no explicit clause connector that begins each clause. These have zero clause connectors, or a syndeton parataxis. Now with a syndeton, there are 2 basic options for its meaning. There are more, but the 2 basic ones are this. First, if you have a clause with a zero clause connector, you can be beginning something new. Or you can be, with a zero clause connector, explaining further a previous clause. We call that apposition or exegetical. So you've got two options. Is this something new? Or are you explaining something that you've already said, but you want to give further details? Normally, we think of the first 5 prohibitions in Exodus 20 as new commandments. So don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't answer against your neighbor with a false testimony, and then don't covet. Then with the 6th one, or the second line in verse 17, we normally take that as appositional or exegetical. That is, it's telling you further how not to covet. And that's done because of the use of the same verb there, highlighted in red, and the same basic conceptual categories of coveting. If we move over to our right column, where we have the Decalogue presented in Deuteronomy 5, at least the last 5 commandments, we see that there's a slightly different discourse layout. We still have 6 contiguous prohibitions, each beginning with the negative particle lo, but we're also going to observe that prohibitions 2 through 6 have prefixed to them the conjunction wow. So in Exodus, you have a syndeton, and in Deuteronomy, you have the clause connector wow. What you can see here is that in Deuteronomy 5, verse 17, you shall not murder, we have a clause with a zero clause connector, and therefore it's beginning something new. There's nothing that's going before it that it's explaining. Then we have a series of 5 more prohibitions, each joined by the conjunction wow. And the conjunction wow, as I said earlier, normally joins things together, equal things together in a series. So this suggests that we're not looking at 5 different commandments here, but we're actually looking at 6 different commandments. The first commandment here in verse 17, that begins, you shall not murder, and then the other 5 commands that follow are in a series with that first command, totaling 6. And you can also see that the verbs have changed here to mark the difference, and even the order of the presentation, wife and then house second. So there's a little bit of an updating here, or making clear what was maybe ambiguous in Exodus 20. So now the use of slightly different discourse features in Exodus 20 than in Deuteronomy 5 may suggest different ways of interpreting or accounting for the number of the Decalogue and how we arrange them. In Exodus 20, we have our traditional 5 commandments that make up the second part of the Decalogue. But in Deuteronomy 5, it looks like we have 6 commandments. We may need to renumber the first 4 commandments. And these are the discourse features in a text that help us to ask and answer certain important questions. It's also important to understand that the rules for discourse analysis with Hebrew prose are slightly different than those rules used for Hebrew poetry. And for that reason, in this resource, we've divided the sections into 2 main parts. We're going to first deal with discourse analysis and discourse features in Hebrew narrative. That's the section that Matthew Patton will cover. And then we'll cover discourse features in Hebrew poetry, and that's the section that Fred Putnam will cover. So it's important to understand that Hebrew is a single and unified language, but there are 2 different language registers within that. There's the narrative section, and then there's the poetic section, and there's going to be slightly different rules. And so rather than try to cover all of the rules under kind of one grouping and then nuance them, narrative versus poetry, we're going to separate them out and help you to become a skilled interpreter of Hebrew narrative and then a skilled interpreter with Hebrew poetry. By way of example, we can look at Exodus 14 and 15, 2 chapters that cover the same basic event, the destruction of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea, and we can see and even feel the different language registers at work and how Hebrew prose is different than Hebrew poetry. Look at your screens with me. On the left, we have the prose account in Exodus 14 of the destruction of Pharaoh's army. And on the right, we have the poetic account of that same event, the destruction of Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. You can see in Exodus 14 that the narrative is carried along by the wow consecutive verbs in the far right-hand side of the column. So Moses stretched out his hand, and the sea returned, and Yahweh shook Egypt into the midst of the sea, and the waters returned, and they covered the chariots and the horsemen. Here we have 5 wow consecutive clauses that carry the narrative through from beginning to end. But you'll observe in Exodus 15 in the right-hand column that there are no wow consecutive verbs. And in fact, the only verb that begins any particular clause is at the very last clause in verse 5. In the first clause, we have a perfect verb. In the second clause, we have a perfect verb. In the third clause, we have an imperfect verb, but not with the wow consecutive. And in the fourth clause, again, we have the perfect verb. So you can see that the choice of verbal conjugation is different, and even the placement of the verbs are different in Hebrew poetry. You'll also see a variety of language in Hebrew poetry that's not normal in Hebrew narrative. For example, the word for sea that we see here is further described as the Red Sea, but also as the deep and also as the depths. And so there's going to be kind of a variety in language, but also a variety in grammar and syntax as well. And so we're going to want to understand, how does poetry work and how does narrative work, and what are the rules that govern each? So as we bring this brief introduction to this resource to an end, let me just suggest to you a few ways in which you can profitably use Basics of Hebrew Discourse. First, work with one genre at a time. That is, spend some time working exclusively with Hebrew prose or narrative. And once you are comfortable in that genre with all the different tools and markers of Hebrew discourse, then move to Hebrew poetry. Don't try to go back and forth learning them both. Master one first, and then come back and master the second. And what you'll find is that you actually, by beginning probably with prose, because it's a little easier, you'll pick up some of the fundamental skills that you'll need for poetry. It'll make poetry feel a little bit better because you already have some basic skills in discourse, even though there's going to be more variety in poetry. Secondly, work incrementally, step by step. That is, when you're thinking about how to work through this resource, you can see that there are different chapters for dealing with different aspects of discourse analysis with prose and then with poetry. Just begin with one feature at a time, master that feature, and then move on. Don't feel like you've got to be in a rush to understand all the features before you can engage in discourse analysis, one thing at a time. So process abstraction. Thirdly, practice, practice, practice. Reading Hebrew, translating Hebrew, interpreting Hebrew, and working with discourse is a skill, and any skill requires practice to become a master at it. This, again, is that whole system of do something, learn from it, make mistakes, correct your mistakes, until you feel like you've got the system down. And the only way to do that is to practice, practice, and practice. And by practicing, you'll make mistakes, and you'll correct your mistakes. So this is a very good process. And then finally, repeat this process as often as you can. Work with one genre at a time, then work incrementally within that genre, one step at a time, and then practice, practice, and practice, because it is skill development, and keep repeating this process. By doing this, you'll train yourself to mine the riches of God's Word, not just to know what the vocabulary means or what a construct chain is, but actually how are texts and clauses related together to create meaning. And by understanding more fully the Word of God, you'll be a better translator and interpreter of that Word.